Welcome to Year 2 of the Funding Love podcast. I'm Mallory Elrod.
And I'm Caitlin Duckworth. We are two adoptive moms that seek to love, support, and elevate all corners of the adoption triad, including adoptive families, adoptees, and birth parents.
We do that through honest conversation with both expert and everyday voices about all things adoption and more, all while running our nonprofit, Funding Love.
We create post-adoption experiences that strengthen bonds, build community, and restore people.
We are Funding Love,
the podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the Funding Love podcast. I am your co-host, Kate, and today we are in episode 105. This is a special one because it is our first ever Funding Love Book Club episode. Today we are reviewing the book titled American Baby by Gabrielle Glaser. We have our book club review team together for this one, which includes myself, my amazing co-host Mal, who you all know and love. We also have Jessie Mattos and Allison Olsen with us. Jessie and Allison are both returning guests, and they bring such an incredible perspective to this book review. Jessie is the birth mom of 13 years, and Allison is an adoptee in a closed adoption and also an adoptive mom. In this episode, we really dive deep into this book, and to be honest, this book has a lot in it, but in a good way, and we do not shy away from the uncomfortable parts of this book. We talk about culture, societal expectations, being a woman in the post-World War II mid-century era, and I'm just saying, this conversation was so good and so insightful, and even if you did not follow along with us by reading the book, you can definitely still follow along in this conversation. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to episode 105 of the Funding Love podcast. We are on our book club first episode review of American Baby. I am so excited. I'm here with Mal, of course, my co-host.
Hello.
And we have Jessie and Allison. So let's go before we jump into this book club because we have so much to talk about. Let's go around the horn and everybody introduce yourself. So everybody can know our voices and where you fall in the triad. So I'm Kate and I am an adoptive mom.
Hi, I am Mallory, and I am also an adoptive mom.
I'm Jessie. I am a birth mom of 13 years.
I'm Allison Olsen. I am an adoptee from closed adoption in 1979. I am also an adoptive parent through an open adoption for my daughter.
There we go. This is going to be awesome, guys. So we are going to review this book, and I think it's so cool that we have all corners represented on this because this book has a lot, and I think we can all pull our own perspective from it. So I'm going to toss to Mal because she's going to give us a synopsis of this book a little bit before we dive in because there's so many themes, but I want y'all to kind of understand what the book's about before we really break it apart.
Yes, I am excited about this episode too because when we announced this book, I feel like as a book club, we kind of like came out of the gate like raring, like we're not going to hold back. We actually had some messages of people being like, I know that book. I don't want to read that book. Like, I feel like that book will break me. To which, whatever, each their own, but I like a good challenge. But we did know that this is a challenging book to read. It's very raw and vulnerable, and it's true, backed by lots of research. So, American Baby, it is by Gabrielle Glaser. And I'll just give a quick synopsis of it. This is like the first paragraph you will find on the back of the book if you pick it up in the bookstore. It says, during the baby boom in the 1960s America, women were encouraged to stay home and raise large families. But sex and childbirth were taboo subjects. Premarital sex was common, but birth control was hard to get and abortion was illegal. In 1961, 16-year-old Margaret Earl fell in love and became pregnant. Her enraged family sent her to a maternity home, and after she gave birth, she wasn't even allowed to hold her own son. Social workers threatened her with jail until she signed away her parental rights. Her son vanished, his whereabouts and new identity known only to an adoption agency that would never share the slightest detail about his fate. Now, as you read the book, we are going to be giving spoilers, but Margaret did move on to marry the father of her child that she unwillingly placed. His name was George Katz. They together had 3 more children that they parented, and their son, whom they placed, whom they called Stephen because they never knew anything about him after he was placed, he grew up known as David, and he grew up to a family that had experienced infertility. He was their only child. There was definitely some broken parts of their story as well that influenced his being raised. And then as he got older, he did find reunification with his mom eventually. His father at that point had passed, and he was very sick with cancer. So that's kind of where their story ended. He reunified with his mother right towards the end of his life, which honestly is a bit tragic. And then the book just really goes through lots of parts of the stories. The book is also really in depth of, she goes back and forth between sharing this narrative, but then also sharing little facts and lots of statistics that have been collected over the years during that time period, which I thought made the book extremely interesting. This book for me, and you guys can chime in, there's some books that you read, it's kind of like slow going and you're like, okay, I'm going to just commit to, reading this 30 minutes a day so I can get through it. This one, I was like, I didn't want to put it down. Like you could really just cruise through it because the content was so, I don't know, mind-blowing? I don't know.
Dense.
What about you guys?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, so
it was a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like it was a lot. I'm just going to say that. I felt like there was so much in there. It was definitely interesting, but I felt like I had to be in a headspace of like, okay, I'm ready to absorb. It's not necessarily a read that you're just like going to relax and feel like it's a love story, easy breezy, because I felt like I wanted to kind of hear every word. So, no, but it was good. I mean, and there was a lot of themes we picked up on.
So I would like to ask one question right off the bat and say, did anybody prior to reading this book for the first time have like some preconceived notions about what it would be about or how it would make you feel?
I'm trying to think. This was the second time I've read this book, and I read it the first time several years ago. It was one of the first adoption books I read. And yeah, it's very, very dense. And like you, Mallory, like I could not put it down. But I don't think anything obviously was really surprising to me. I'd already done, enough education and research on my own and been involved in the adoption community for several years already. But it was just very validating in a lot of ways. And especially going back the second time and being able to focus on the details and looking for similarities between me and Margaret, and, her own experience. So nothing really surprised me because I've lived it myself and I know women who have experienced similar treatment. It's unfortunate. But there's so many things that were in this book that are still happening today. And it's like so frustrating to read about what was going on in like the 60s and 70s and even before.
Yeah.
And the themes and the comments that people make. And it's like, we're still doing that. We're still here.
Yeah.
Yes. What about you, Allison? Did you have any like prior to reading it preconceived ideas?
I didn't. The only thing that I would say is that usually when I go in to read a book about adoption, I like to first know how the author is connected. And so I was a little apprehensive knowing that the only connection she had was this individual. Like she herself was not touched by adoption or any like immediate relatives. And so that I was a little worried, but she's such a good writer that's why it was such a smooth read. The one thing I will give, especially for adoptees, and adoptees like me from the 70s or 60s, anywhere where it's a closed adoption, to just be, trigger warning. It is a happy story. It is a happy story where a birth mother wants to be reunited with her son. And that is not always the case for us adoptees. So that's the only thing that I would say when I'm reading it, I don't see as many similarities, right, with my own story. But it's wonderful to read and it's wonderful to we'll get into all the details, but how much Margaret wanted to be with her son and the system is what stopped her from being with her son. And just that's not the case for all adoptees. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Wow. I think it's already so crazy, the perspectives of sitting in different points of the triad, because, from a birth mom perspective, it seems like you're leaning into the forced adoption or the maternity home and like the tragicness of that. And then Allison is seeing it from, her mother or his mother missed him, didn't want to place him, searched for him, like that's a positive thing. And then me and Caitlin are probably on the other side being like, those adoptive parents were lied to. They were a part of a system of coercion and commodity that whether they wanted to or not, they were playing into it. So I felt very frustrated reading the whole book. And so it's just, I love that we are covering the perspectives here so that all of our listeners can kind of see how multifaceted adoption is. I feel like so often adoption just gets this one like adoption is love. It's happy, and it took a bad situation and made it good, and like slap that on there, and then move on.
Yeah.
And it's just so different than
Yes,
that.
it is.
Yeah. So Mal, let's talk about some themes that we were talking about that we were able to pull from this. Like early on, there was, for me, I'll just say it was like the lack of education, I felt like, for these women in the, or I don't even know what you'd call it. Maybe it was just society and culture of the idea of what like sex was and what being a woman was and what it meant to be a woman and a mom. And as you like, but then also the shame in that at the same time. But what you're like, there was just such like a confusion. So, I mean, that was to me a very big part in the, I think I highlighted so many moments where I felt like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I think that sex education and then the like layers of perception on what sex is and then the results of sex, even on gender, like the man and the woman. So yeah, somebody share some thoughts on that.
I've said this before, and maybe I've shared it with you guys, but the conversations that we have about single mothers, unwed mothers starts in adolescence. The way that society views single mothers is going to influence women if they find themselves in a similar position. I know that was certainly an influence for me. I've shared this with you guys before. I didn't know a single mother. I think I knew one, sort of. And so the lack of sex education, the lack of exposure, and the lack of relationships that people have impact their decision, obviously. And so it goes beyond just sex education and what can result from sex. It's also the conversations we're having about family and what that looks like and how you support family. And that's where society drops the ball as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is that mid-century, post-World War II, when this is taking place, post-World War II, where they are in this America, right? That is like kind of in this new wave of what America is going to be. People are moving to the suburbs, having families, and women stay at home. Husbands are out for the day. They come back. It's a beautiful family of maybe 2 to 4 kids, mom and a dad. Great, right? So in this idealistic society now, you have you're a young woman who finds herself pregnant. And they're like, that cannot be in my family. That cannot represent who I am. And then there starts the whole of like, okay, how are we going to hide this? How are we going to make sure nobody knows that this is a part of my family? So I don't know. I mean, I don't, to me, it was just so much there was so much even in that statement that I just said, because then that makes that baby, what is that baby then? That baby is just like something that can be, it's about the shame of the woman, not like, okay, this life that is here, what are we going to do for this baby? There's so much in that. I can't even unpack it myself.
And then shifting that baby to another family. And for a long time during that period, I mean, David knew he was adopted, but there were a lot of people in society. There was this cookie cutter version of your life, and nothing could go outside of it. Right. So never mind LGBTQ, it's like nothing could be outside of this cookie cutter, even infertility, which doesn't seem like that far outside of that box. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that also, perpetuated this, okay, now you have an adopted child in your family. You cannot tell them they're adopted. You must make it seem like you're all one family, so it as a societal thing, which again did not specifically happen in that book, but it all breeds into each other. Yeah. And for the education, I mean, and I'm getting further in the book, but I mean, they never educated these mothers. They were about to give birth, and they went to the hospital not knowing what was going to happen, scared to death.
Right.
All alone. By the way, literally
all alone, and the nurses being cruel to them. Mm-hmm. That just, that's the stuff. So, I mean, it was just interesting the way she painted the picture of society.
Mm-hmm. That there was this,
how it affects
and I think
so many facets of the situation. Even for me, like when I was pregnant at 19, I was too ashamed to go to any sort of like pregnancy courses or classes. Because I didn't want anyone to know. I mean, my pregnancy was a secret. And so I remember my mom, like we checked out a DVD or something of like like a labor video, like how to help through labor. My older sisters hadn't had kids yet. So I didn't know what I was doing. And it was like this outdated video.
It must have been terrifying. Were you like terrified?
No, because I was so detached. I was such in a like protective state of mind that I was trying not to focus too much on it, if that makes sense. I was really protecting myself from a lot of the emotions. And so by the time I went into labor, I was in survival mode. That's really what it was. And funny with my situation is I was actually induced. And so I knew it was coming. And I remember when I went to my doctor's appointment on my due date, he walks in the room. He says, all right, we're scheduled to induce you tomorrow at, 9 a.m. So I went home and I started and completed a puzzle in one day because I just didn't know what to do. I was like, I'm just going to do a puzzle. I had to keep my mind occupied. And yeah, you block out, those heavy emotions because it's too much to deal with. So I wasn't scared. I was, numb, I guess, in a way. But I know plenty of women who today, labor by themselves. They don't tell anyone. They go to the hospital and have the baby and they return home and tell their roommate that they just were away for the weekend and they have no clue. So it still happens. The stuff is still occurring. And nurses, poor treatment of birth mothers, and it happens all the time.
It's so true. And it just folds into that theme of social perception and the value of a baby, but like the value of a baby at a specific time in your life. Because I think that it like you said, Caitlin, during that time, and it still happens today based on a family's beliefs or moralities or social status or where they live in the country. But based on social perception, they think, oh, my teenager got pregnant. That looks bad on me.
Right.
That's not good for them. This has to be fixed. It wasn't, like you said, it wasn't thought about the mom or baby. It was about how are we being perceived in the world. And it really does place this odd value system on a baby of when it's wanted, how it's acquired. Because, in Margaret's situation, being a teenager, that devalued her life. She was a broken woman. She needed to get rid of this. She needed to solve the problem. But for, like, let's say David's parents who were trying to have a child, that was their not having a baby meant you're failing in some way, so you need to go have a baby. And then, like you said, hiding adoptions, Allison, if you couldn't have one naturally and you had to adopt, well, that was like a lesser value of a baby.
Right,
so because you couldn't have one on your own, there's something wrong with you. So it's just all of these layers of brokenness that all stem from us valuing this like social perception
over the I mean in the book, in the book there's a part that I wrote here in my notes is when Margaret, this kind of goes into everything we're talking about right now, she goes to the gynecologist for the first time after she knows she's pregnant. Never been to a gynecologist, has no idea what she's even doing there. She's laying on the table in this position that she's never been in and is like so exposed and feels so vulnerable and is like, has no idea even what is happening, like what the doctor's going to do. And so she recalls that as such like a mortifying time. And then on the way out, the doctor says to her, come back when you're married and pregnant, and I'll make sure no one finds out about this one, which is basically saying like her pregnancy and her baby were not important. Like everything that she was going through didn't matter. And even the baby didn't matter. We're not going to tell anybody about
erase
this.
it.
We're going to erase this. And just like you said, making it more of a thing like, oh, when you're married and pregnant, not a big deal. Come on back. But then when she's laying there, it's so shameful. That baby is so shameful. Like, you know what I mean?
And in the book, you get to go along with her because later she does get married to David's father and then has other children. And I just could feel the emotion from the book, where she's like, oh, now it's okay. Her parents were fine with it. His parents are all of a sudden fine with it. Same doctors, same nurses, fine with it.
Throw a baby shower. Yay.
Oh, she does. She talks about like the feelings, the conflicting feelings she's having about celebrating, her child or her children that she has after marriage. And yeah, I feel like a lot of birth mothers can relate to that. We talked about the wedding rings, and how in the maternity homes, they had them wear fake wedding rings when they went out. And I remembered I did the same thing. I'd never end up purchasing one, but there was a time at the beginning where I was looking for a ring, I was in Walmart or I was at a store looking online to find a ring to wear when I went out in public.
Wow.
And even to this day, I will find myself making sure, looking down to make sure that I've got my wedding band on or my wedding ring is showing to legitimize my motherhood. And this isn't conscious, I'm not making this decision. I just kind of will pay attention to it when it happens. But, it's still like it affects me this many years later. Even though I've got my kids next to me and, we're walking through Publix and I'm like, oh, do I have my ring on?
Right.
Right. And the weight of that.
No, I mean, and talking about that, like what you're having more children with her husband after, when they get married and in this, what ideal life now that is accepted, but she recalls like, one thing I loved about Margaret and the way that she wrote this book is it really made it aware that she was always thinking about Stephen/David, always, like in every new season of life, wondering where was he, how would he fit in, what would he think, is he doing okay, does he have a backyard like this, does he have like all of those questions that would come up. But another thing that when she became a mom again later, like it felt like she was maybe like being mom to the 10th degree, like super mom, wanting to, and I don't know, and Jessie, you could speak to this, was she trying to like compensate for what had happened? So she's going to be like, well, I'm going to be the mom, like super mom, so that, I don't know,
the neighborhood mom, that all the kids want to come hang out at our house, and I'll give them snacks.
I'm going to be PTA mom. I'm going to go on all the field trips. I'm going to do all this, doing all of the things that, I don't know, is it just a natural thing, or like we were kind of saying before we were recording, is that who she is, or is she, what came first, right?
Yeah, what came first? Was she always a nurturer, or was it amplified after her placement?
Correct.
And there's signs that she was definitely a nurturer before that.
Sure.
But yeah, I do think that her experience did amplify that characteristic where maybe she, was compensating and trying to prove to herself and to the world that she is a good mother and that she can take care of her children, and not just that, she can take care of everyone else on top of it. And, and I also wonder how much of her doing that was from guilt. She takes care of her family and or her parents and her in-laws very well, knowing that her relationship was very chaotic with them. And so was she making up for that? Was she carrying that shame of, I put my parents through this embarrassment, now I have to prove to them that I'm worthy and care for them until their dying day? So sure, I think she was always like that, but an element, her placement certainly added to that. But we see it in David. I mean, he was a nurturer to his entire community, and that we heard that a lot in this story. So it's obvious that it's, inherited, because he's got it too. So, but also for him, maybe he was more nurturing because of his status as an adoptee. And we'll never know.
Yeah. I do want to bring up a point that I have here in my notes about like the adoption process then. Like with Louise Y's agency, right? Is this agency that they talk about in this book where Margaret went, and that's where she placed, and that's where, it all happened. But I felt like there was so many things about this process that were so yucky that I kind of just want to, talk about that. Especially, let's talk for one thing that's on my mind is that the babies, after Margaret had her son, Louise Y places them in a foster home. That child in the foster home for 5, 8, 10 months, a year, while they're trying to make the perfect match for this baby. Let's let the baby develop.
Common.
Yes. It's wild to me. Let's let this baby develop, see who they are, see what the characteristics are, so that we can place them in a family that he quote unquote matches with and that he would fit with best. And you know what I mean? As if it was like Mal was saying, a classification of a human. Right?
Yeah. And it's such a skewed perception of development. And because we know so much more about child development now, and the fact that he was denied skin-to-skin contact because a nurse did not take him from Margaret and then hold him skin to skin. He was probably maybe held for feedings. The detrimental side effects of not having skin to skin, being held, contact as an infant alone is a huge deal. We know now that even just maybe your skin to skin contact not even being your birth mom, so that immediately all sounds, smells, everything is completely different, can have like a traumatic effect on like the nervous system. Then you're talking about you're being raised in a foster home where they were saying they'd spend hours a day in a crib, having their basic needs met. They'd hand them a toy, interact with them a little bit, but ultimately they're changing them, they're feeding them, they're making sure they're not getting hurt. So like, how are we to like even say that they're developing in a way that would have in any way like resembled what would have been in even an adoptive family home?
Yeah.
Like they would have been cared for differently than in it was more like an orphanage, it sounded like, than a foster situation.
Yeah.
And so it's really, truly mind-blowing. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Allison, as like an adoptee. I'm sure that you've done more research or have any sort of experience with this.
Yes. So I would say, some things in adoption make me sad. This stuff makes me mad. Especially all of the like testing that was done on adoptees. And Louise Wise is like the biggest, guiltiest party, right? All of the testing that they allowed, splitting up twins and triplets.
Oh my gosh.
Like, it's really, really disgusting.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Like snapping their feet with rubber bands to see how loudly they cry.
Oh my God.
And
You guys are going to get
there's
me crying.
more
I
tests
can't.
that weren't even in this book that were done to adopt.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
like it's awful. The history of it. Awful.
It is really,
It's like they're lab
really
rats. Literally, like,
up.
these adoptees. There's some sort of like,
Yeah.
let's take these kids that don't have a home and we'll use them for our experiments, right?
Yeah.
And
Quote,
these
unquote.
children,
Right.
these children that were wanted and were loved.
Yes.
And even were so loved, these adoptive parents are sitting there waiting
Yeah.
to get their kids. I mean, it was super messed up. And so to me, I read lots of books, I watch lots of documentaries on this stuff, and I just have to, I have to like check my mental health after it. It's like, it's that bad, because it's just really messed up, especially going back to like this book. There's Margaret wanting to be with her son. And I feel bad that I forget David's parents, because they're talked about a little bit, but I just don't remember their names. But
Esther
the
and
adoptive
Ephraim
parents,
or something, I think. Esther
thank
and
you,
Ephraim. Yeah.
thank you. They're wanting this child too, and then the foster home does not have enough time. Like they were told not to connect too. I don't know if that was in this book or other things I've seen, but back then, anyone that would foster the in between placements intentionally did not show love, so that the child wasn't disappointed when they went to another home, which is also, really extremely messed up. And I'm glad that, overarchingly we have moved forward a little bit as an adoption community, where we're not allowing formal tests like this to go on. But there's still, the system is still pretty messed up, especially in the foster care system. So
For sure. It just makes me wonder how many adults even today maybe had undiagnosed like READ, like the reactive attachment disorders and things like that because of this. And they would say later in life, oh, they've just got anger management issues, or they just
sure.
never let anyone close. They push people away. But really, like, their brain developed in such a way that they now have an attachment disorder because of the situations they were placed in. And I think that, there's people at fault here.
Yeah.
It's hard for me not to like point a finger and be like, you are so wrong.
Entire systems at fault. Yeah. I mean, even the damage of bringing an adoptee into an adoptive family's home and lying to them their whole lives that they're, you're not adopted. And they're like, well, you all have, blonde hair and blue eyes, and I have dark skin and black hair. No, you're not adopted. I mean, just like, the damage that does. And then the surprise of being told later or finding out later is, so I'm glad that we have moved a bit, we've progressed within our bubble a bit for the open adoption. I mean, I bet you that, well, in their case, Margaret wouldn't have even wanted open adoption. She wanted to raise her son.
She wanted to parent her child.
That's exactly.
I was kind of surprised, though, at how open David's parents were about his adoption, for the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, he was not shy about letting people know that he was adopted. And even at the end, when it talks about when they're, reunified, that he's introducing everyone, his mom to everyone as his birth mom. He didn't have any shame in, when it came to his adoption, which I thought was really cool, because you just don't really find that, because there wasn't a lot of research. People didn't understand, and they were researching the wrong things, like we've just talked about, and even the skin to skin contact, that wasn't really developed until the 1970s. So they didn't have this information about infant care. And it almost felt like the treatment of these children was like punishment for moms. You did this, this is your fault that your child's being treated like this. Like, indirectly, that's kind of how it felt to me when I was going through this book. Like, they wanted Margaret to know that he, wasn't in a home or whatever, like that. Even though that wasn't really a situation, like it just felt like they were doing it out of spite in some instances, to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah. So for Margaret, she goes to, unwillingly, her mother takes her to this agency. They come up with a plan. She's going to go to Lakeview Maternity Home, right? Which is one of many maternity homes that just scattered across the country at that time. And was sent there. And it talks about her experience there of just kind of watching these young girls all alone. And some of them embraced their stories, some didn't, and whatever it was. But she gave birth alone, then sent home, right? And that is, giving birth alone, to me, seems like a very cruel thing. Like, I don't know, like that really caught me every time they said that they gave birth alone and gave birth alone. Like, that is, I don't know, like a form of torture in some way. Like, that is not having any sort of support with you whatsoever. But she's just one of, how many stories. But the thing that, so after she comes home, right? I just loved her hope of reunification in this whole book, because she was like, okay, I'm going to come home. George and I are going to get married. We're going to figure out how we can get married. And then I'm going to go back, and they're going to be like, okay, she can have her son. Right. And in this time, while she's still hopeful and still waiting for that getting married to George, she's able to meet up with her son, a couple times, like through many, many asks, and I think begging the agency, can I at least see him? How's he doing? Which I just love to see her heart there. And one of the last times she sees him, talking about coercion, how many times they've asked her to sign the papers, like, sign these papers for your son, sign these papers. We need to find him a family. We have families waiting for him. Just like coming up with like a lie after lie.
These like high status families as well.
Correct. Some diplomat.
They would like lie to her.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it just, time after time, they came to her to sign the papers. And I love how she was so steadfast and so convicted and so headstrong and did not want to sign those papers until they literally threatened her and said, you're going to go to jail if you don't sign these papers, because we have a family waiting for him. And come to find out, it was a massive lie. Like, just creating these lies to get these women to sign papers, just, I don't know. It makes me want to throw up.
Yeah.
It literally makes me want to throw up, because I know, like I said, this is just one of how many stories that happen across the country. Still happening today, I'm sure, in some way.
Yeah. It absolutely is happening today. I mean, women will get threatened that an agency or someone will call Child Protective Services on them when they get home from the hospital with their child, or they threaten them, to sue them over financial assistance. If you don't place your child with us, then you owe us, all this money back. And people follow through with that. They actually do it. And, it happens all the time, just in more discreet ways. It's not gone anywhere. People are more creative about it, unfortunately.
Yeah. It seems like the system or it seems like people are still monetizing adoption.
Mm-hmm.
It's done a bit differently. It's done a bit more behind the scenes. Whereas like there was a part in the book that really surprised me too, just like the blatant like advertisement. Like you got a pregnant girl, like we need a baby. You could bring her here. We'll take great care of her. This like, and then the competitiveness of the
business
maternity homes as well. It was like, well, we are an elite maternity home and you're going to have to pay a lot of money to come here. And then in turn, we're going to charge them a lot of money to take your baby home. Like it was just, it really turned human life into such a commodity. And then Allison, to your point too, with the adoptees, and them wanting to spend that 10 months or 18 months seeing, are they blonde-headed, red-headed, or brunette? Because then we can match you. Well, they have blue eyes like you, so it'll be less likely to people question that this is your child. Or it was infuriating, but it's also crazy to think that on a smaller scale and a more behind-the-scenes scale, stuff like this still happens today. People are still taken advantage every day by agencies that are in it for the money because they see the way babies can bring money.
Yeah, it takes on a whole new meaning, baby crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about advertisements, and we can touch on Georgia Tan a little bit if you don't mind, because she was mentioned in this book, and that is a woman that is worth researching. If the listeners have not researched her, she popularized privatized adoption, and it talks about eugenics in the book a little bit and how adoption really wasn't the cool thing to do. You didn't mix, lesser value children with the elite. And Georgia Tan was like, wait a second, I think I can spin this. And so she was literally stealing these children. I mean, there's stories of her luring them into her limo with ice cream. And back then it was, if you were a single mother, you could get your children taken away for just being a single mother. And so she would work with, law enforcement and, healthcare workers to still kidnap these children. And what she would do is she would take these children, dress them up in really nice clothing. She'd make them look very pretty, and she would parade them around cities in baskets for people to look at. And, oh, it's so cute. Like, I'll take that one. And she put ads in newspapers, yours for the asking. And there's one that's like, George wants to play catch, but he needs a daddy to complete the team or whatever. I mean, there's just really weird stuff. And
you're just taking that marketing degree and using it for babies. Like, that's insane.
Yeah. And the history,
and I mean,
a lot of children died in her care too, because she had the Tennessee Children's Home, and she would take these kids and put a bunch of them in a crib. They wouldn't get the right medical care. A lot of them died. I think it's like 500 to 600 that we know of died in her care, and it's most likely more. But it's just horrible. I mean, that there are children that were placed in this time period that are still alive, and their children are now also suffering from the impacts of this and having to navigate their own identity and lack of information. It affects generations and generations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And sadly, some of the stuff that she put in place are still laws in place today. So it's really problematic, a lot around privacy. But I know, Jessie, you were mentioning, specifically, her honing in on single moms. It was anyone poor. Anyone poor. She truly believed that was such a bad affliction to be poor, that was a sin, that she was saving these children by taking them away from poor, loving families. And then selling them to, at the time, celebrities and then really anyone that could pay.
Yeah, she made like $11 million. I mean, that was, and she
and way back in the day.
And she died just a few days before her trial. And she wasn't even, and maybe Allison, this, she wasn't even being investigated for her, like, the crime she committed against children. It was like money fraud or something, like, I don't know what it was, but
money laundering. Yeah.
And she died of cervical cancer. Was that it? Or uterine cancer? She died of cancer just a couple days before her trial, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, it's just insane, some of this stuff. And I love what the author did in this book, though. We mentioned it's such a dense book, and not being connected to the adoption world, she does just really, really good job of explaining things and throwing in a lot of information and tying it into the story. She just did a really, really good job. I mean, I know this book is pretty heavy, but I think it's also really good introduction for people who don't know anything about adoption. And, you know, I had a friend recently read it. She's got no connection to the adoption world, but she just really likes historical fiction books, things like that. And so I recommended it to her, and she's like, holy cow. I'm like, yeah, it's a much larger issue than the average person knows or wants to acknowledge.
Yeah, she paints some good pictures. I feel like even the way that she develops, like she tells Margaret's story, she paints a lot of pictures of moments in time for her that I actually had like a visceral reaction to. Like truly, like there's a moment where she went to Louise Y's agency years later in life, right? Her kids are getting older, and she's like, I'm going to go leave my information there. So Stephen, when he comes there, he knows my information. He can seek me out. And then she creates a story in her head where she's telling herself on the way to the agency, what if he already has a letter there for me? What if he wrote a letter and is waiting there? And then she gets hopeful and excited about that letter that's going to be there that she created in her head. But she's still so hopeful because she wants this. She gets there and she knocks on the door, rings the doorbell. They turn her away, and she rings multiple times. And once again, they threaten to call the cops if she doesn't leave the premises. And the way that she painted the picture of Margaret's reaction, I was like, oh my gosh. And I have it here because it was a note. It was like Margaret fell to her knees buckled, and she crumpled into the floor, curled in fetal position. At first, she was mute. And then when the cry finally emerged, it seemed disembodied, like hanging in the air as if it had come from far away. And then panic, rage, fear, and shame sprang from a deep well. So it was like, you feel like in the way that Gabrielle, the author, paints that, it was like, oh my gosh, it's if you can't react to that, you know, I just felt like she really, I don't know, I felt for Margaret, like personally, I felt for Margaret, like she was like my friend right there. But anyways, just to your point, Jessie, she did a great job in this book, and I feel like it's a good read for anybody.
Yeah, I do too.
And go ahead, Allison.
I was just going to add one thing from like an adoptee's perspective on that is like, especially from a closed adoption. So what I got was one piece of paper about my birth family. It's about 3, maybe 4 paragraphs, not even a whole page. Right. So, and they're kind of short paragraphs. Very, very little detail and information. Now, as everyone has, read this book, some may be facts, some may not, and this is all adoptees have to go off of. It is what we grasp and hold on to. In fact, it's even really, really part of the book we're reading next quarter. But just, she was going there. She kept calling to give different key medical family information so that he could know that, there are these things that you might encounter, and I want you to be prepared. They didn't even bother to write it down. They didn't even bother to put it in his file, let alone to let him know. And just so that everyone knows, this is what adoptees live for. And the truth is, we all live for it, but we just don't recognize it with adoptees. Everyone's got that uncle that's obsessed with your family tree, right? He's been on Ancestry for over a decade, building it all out. And he's like, you know what? We got these people that, started this village over in wherever, right? Everyone is curious about it. It's just somehow tough for folks to accept that adoptees also want to know about it. But just the hardness of reading that same phrase from an adoptee thinking, I want that information so bad. Why she is trying so hard to give that. And it is this system of constantly blocking things. Like it's interesting how systems are in place where if they were not, we would have a different world, right? Like this is information the adoptee wants. This is information that the birth mom Margaret wants to give. It's like why it's being stopped is it just
seems like a basic
crazy
human right
and
to know
cruel.
Those things. It's like a basic human right. Yes, for relationships to happen and for information to be passed along.
To be a healthy adult. Correct. Think about how long Stephen, who for anyone who didn't read the book, adoptive parents named him David, like. He died very, very young, And he would have, well, for modern day, right? He could have lived to be much older if he had known in advance that they had these specific things that ran in their family. And just to like give an update on like where are we at in 2024? Now, granted, this was about 15 years ago that I went and searched for my birth family, but it was extensive red tape. And keep in mind, I was assigned a social worker. This social worker has my full file, every bit of information I want and deserve and have the right to have. And my taxpayer dollars, all of our taxpayer dollars are paying this person's salary to hide this from me. An adult to this day, it's 2024, same problem. And so I don't think that people fully understand the damage of closed adoptions, the damage of this. In their case, Margaret's crying and buckling to her knees that she can't get some information in there, that she can't have this correspondence. Adoptees, we just want names. We just, from a closed adoption, we just want names and we want medical history. And then we can go from there if there's a relationship or not. Right? Yeah. But it's crazy that is legally, and again, every state is different, but there's a lot of work to do with legislation to clear that up. But when I tell people are often shocked. They just assume I talk about adoption. I've got these children's books, like that everything must be hunky-dory and I must now have an open relationship with my family, like my daughter does. And it's not the case.
It definitely isn't. And one of my favorite things that they talk about in the book is how on page 275, he's talking about how there's a whole other West Wing, and imagine that wing is for you and that holds all of your information, yet there's a guard standing in the way blocking you. And I'm not adopted, I don't know how this feels, but I imagine like if you're growing up in an adoptive home, and you're so desperate to see similarities that the differences are probably so much more obvious. And, people who are not adopted, who have their information, like we take that for granted. We don't know that struggle. We don't know how that must feel to not be grounded. You're kind of floating in this in between with no real connection to either side of the family. And, biologically, we look for similarities to make us feel safe within our community, to know who's a safe person, who I can rely on, who I can trust. But if you don't have access to your basic likenesses, I can imagine the internal struggles that come from that. It's, and adopted people, they didn't have a choice. As a birth mother, like I chose that for my daughter. Essentially, my first parenting decision for my daughter was to be separated from me. That is a hard reality that I have to accept and be prepared for any emotions that might come from it. At what point do we give that choice back to the adoptees? Because it doesn't seem like we ever really do. If they never have access to their information, we're never really giving them that choice. Like I said, Allison, if they even want to pursue a relationship with their biological family, like it, and birth parents need to accept that your child will have a choice one day. It should always be, understood that closed adoptions, that information will be out there. And we know now that there's actually only 3.5 degrees of separation thanks to social media and to DNA testing. And so your children will find you. So adoptive parents, if you're listening, your children will find their biological family. Are you preparing them for that relationship? Are you setting the stage for them? What are you doing to help them with that transition? Because the earlier you start building that relationship with their biological family, the easier it's going to be for them later down the road when they're able to have their own relationship with them. Down to even the conversations and how you talk to them. Like, what are you doing? Because it starts now. Do you want to make it really hard for your child, or do you want to make it as seamless as possible?
And I want to add to that, to make adoptive parents feel comfortable enough to do that. So as an adoptee, nothing will undo all of the owies you have kissed over the years, all of the hugs and snuggles, being there for your child during all the different times they needed you, whether it was something wonderful happening, you were there to see the big goal in the soccer game, or you were there during the first breakup and helping them through it. Nothing undoes that. As I said, it is a human need that everyone wants to know about their own biology. That's why everyone does these tests, right? We want to know our medical history. We want to know, even if nobody in the biological family had cancer, we want to know if potentially we could have a certain kind of cancer, right? Like, we want to know what we're predisposed to. We want to know other people that maybe look like us, sound like us, have mannerisms like us. These things are important. So the thing I will say in conjunction with Jessie is to give adoptive parents some comfort. Please, please have confidence that there is not an additional mom or dad that's going to come and take your place. It is more people to love your child. And that cannot be a bad thing.
Yeah. I think that was like one of my biggest takeaways from this book, as we like wrap up here in a second, was that I did, as an adoptive parent, like seeing, kind of like wrapping all of that in, because I know we've talked about the birth mom perspective and then the adoptee perspective, but like seeing some elements of adoptive parents and things that I relate to, even in Esther, David's adoptive mom. Like, I and Caitlin, I know we haven't struggled with infertility, so we came to adoption in a different way. But we know so many that have struggled with infertility. It's also a problem in the U.S. that no one will talk about that as well. But seeing even the way she parented David and some of the parenting choices that she made, and sometimes, she would over coddle him, like when he had, issues with his weight and his health, and the dad would be like, we should cook healthier meals, and she's like, no, I'm gonna make him this because it's what he wants, and I want to be loved, and I don't want to upset him. And like the way she would coddle him, and how adoptive parents can feel that insecurity of, it is something that adoptive parents can carry. It's an insecurity of knowing that you're not their biological mother, and then overcompensating for that in other ways too. And I think, to your point, Allison, the times when we do, because we do know there's stories where an adoptee grows up and they're frustrated with their adoptive family for keeping secrets and telling lies. And those are the instances when you see if they find their biological family and it was a happy story. We know sometimes it's not, but if it was, those are the situations where the adoptive family is like, well, they loved us and they loved them more. But it's honestly because in that like protectivism of themselves and that guardedness of not allowing the adoptee to experience or talk about their feelings surrounding their adoption. Those are the things that we think we're protecting ourselves as adoptive parents, but really you're creating a wall, you're creating a rift, you're creating a point of contention in your future relationship. And so I think seeing myself in some of the things that Esther does, or seeing some of those things that even I don't relate to, but I can see in friends or situations that I've seen around me, there is still, I know that as adoptive moms, like we have the narrative of we won, like there's nothing to complain about. We have the baby and there's no loss. But there is a ton of loss in raising a child that's not biologically yours. And denying that doesn't change it, doesn't make parenting an adoptee any less complicated, because there's so many more layers there that you don't have otherwise. And so I think it's good for us to acknowledge that. And it's good for adoptive moms. I know when I read this, and I'm so angry about how babies are treated as commodities and paid for, and I'm sitting here being like, our adoption was expensive. Who made money off of that? How am I contributing to this? I think that we need to ask ourselves as adoptive parents those hard questions. How am I contributing to this? And how, if I'm an advocate like I am, if you're someone that, adoption wasn't a one-time thing for you, you're listening to this podcast, you're interested in the adoption world, like how can we help to make sure that systems like this are being put to bed and ethical systems are in place to help birth moms parent if they want to, find good options for them if they need to place? Like, how are we helping the system get better instead of perpetuating it by just participating in it because we just want a baby?
Yep.
Like we've got to kind of ask ourselves those hard questions and look to ourselves through a really hard filter. It's hard to look in the mirror and see those things of like, but I just want to be a mom. But we've got to stop just seeing it in that way. And I think that once we do, even raising our adoptees in an open way is going to be easier. And then it makes it sets us up for a better relationship with our adoptee long term.
And I heard one thing, can't remember who said this, but they're basically talking about the more secure or the more information an adopted child has about their biology, the more secure they feel with their adoptive parents. And so I hope that's an encouragement to the ones that are listening. Like we said, there's always more love for this child or for the child that you're parenting. And if they have access to that information, that is not going to create a divide. It's only going to make them feel supported and loved and cared for that much more, because you're recognizing that this child experienced something very challenging, and they will be constantly working through it their entire lives. And if you're there to support them, if you've got that information for them, if you're leaving the door open for all of these conversations, they're going to feel so much more secure because they know that you truly care. And it's not just about getting a baby. It's about about their humanity.
Yeah. They're going to grow in confidence in who they are, the more information they have. So sets them up to be a successful human.
Yes.
That's all we want all of our children to be successful humans in a contributing society. Yeah. Anyways, this was fun. I mean, honestly, I didn't know how this was going to go because there's so much to unpack here, but I think we kind of did a great job at touching on all of the points that like made us all feel icky, the points that made us all feel reflective, and look in the mirror, like Mal was saying, and also seeing ourselves and having empathy for each other in this process, because I think that is important to have these conversations with all of us here, all of us with different perspectives, because I think this is where we're going to start breaking down those walls, Mal, like you were saying. This is where we're going to start hopefully fixing this, is understanding we are all on the same team, because the child is the one at the center. So, but listen, before we close this episode, I'm going to toss it back to you, Mal, because we're going to make an announcement of what our next book is in the next quarter. So go ahead, take it away.
That's right. So thank you to everyone that read along with us. Thank you to those that sent in questions, like our good friend Natalie.
Yeah.
We incorporated and folded so many of those into our conversation today, and we hope to have even more of those in the future. Our next book that we are going to be doing next quarter is called You Should Be Grateful: Stories of Race, Identity, and Transracial Adoption. It is by Angela Tucker. So you have 3 months to read that book, go through it, send us your comments and questions to hello@fundinglove.com. We had so much fun discussing this book, and I feel like we only scratched the surface. So if you still haven't read American Baby, we encourage you to do that. But our next book is going to be You Should Be Grateful by Angela Tucker. So check that out from the library, grab it off of Amazon, and we cannot wait to have our next episode on that book.
Could be awesome. Thank you, ladies. And I look forward to the next one. Y'all are awesome. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to this episode of the Funding Love Podcast. We'll see y'all next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Funding Love Podcast. We are a crowd-funded nonprofit, which means that people like you can help make a lasting impact in the lives of adoptive families and birth moms. At Funding Love, we create post-adoption experiences that strengthen bonds, build community, and restore people. And when you partner with us, whether that is giving online, signing up to become a monthly donor, or simply buying merchandise from our shop, you are funding love.